And today I'm really excited to share this mushroom chilaquiles recipe that actually didn't make it into La Vida Verde, which is my cookbook that just came out in April. My publisher didn't want breakfast in the book. I had so many breakfast recipes and they're like, oh no, no breakfast. We want to stick to just like main dishes. So maybe in the future I'll have a breakfast book or something like that. All the different chilaquiles versions that you can make. And chilaquiles is a dish that I love so much. I make it really often, maybe typically on the weekends, like maybe every other weekend or so. And I make it with a variety of different salsas. Like the one today is going to be a tomatillo base, which is a lot more bright and tangy. It has a little bit of the sour note because of the tomatillos. But I've made it with the salsa de tomate. I've made it with a salsa de chipotle. So many different variations. You can add, different chiles to it. And the idea is just, to get this really nice sauce and just coat some totopos or some tortilla chips really quickly. I like a little bit of crispiness still in my tortilla chips. I know some people cook it as more of a casserole, and the tortilla chips tend to kind of sop up the liquid and things like that. So I like to find that in between where there's still a little bit of a bite to the tortilla chip and it can still kind of hold up its shape. So we're going to make a series of different things. And what's really awesome is that this recipe was featured in LA Times last year. So I actually made this recipe for a brunch, and there were essentially it was a bunch of strangers who are in the food industry cooking together. And I didn't know who everybody was. And I made this chilaquiles dish for that brunch. And one of the people at the brunch was a LA Times food writer. And so she's like, I want to feature this dish. It's the best chilaquiles I've ever had, which is such an honor. And she was so amazed, more so because it's all vegan, because you typically see chilaquiles being made with like shredded chicken or eggs, or it has, the actual crema, the dairy-based crema or cheese or something like that over the top. And she really enjoyed it. So I'll be making that recipe today. And I wasn't able to find just oyster mushrooms at my local grocery store. So I will note that I have a variety of different mushrooms that I'm using here. I have some shiitakes. I have some king oyster mushrooms that are different from the regular oyster mushrooms that you see in the photo of the book. And these are beech mushrooms, B-E-E-C-H. And so I'll be cooking a variety of these off. And I'm going to make the full recipe for the salsa de tomatillo. I'll make all the mushrooms and the crema and the queso fresco. But I'll just be making a little bit of chilaquiles since it's just me right now. So, and then I will get started with cooking the tomatillos and the jalapeño and just show you how I pretty quickly like to cook those off. And while those are cooking, we'll get into our chipotle cashew crema, which I really love because the crema obviously has like this nice silky consistency that works really well in contrast with the chilaquiles. And then it also provides, a nice contrast against the tanginess of the tomatillo salsa. So it kind of grounds it, I think, and it gives it that nice creamy texture. And I'm using chipotle in adobo for that particular cashew crema, just to give it another note, to have it sing in a different way than just a regular cashew crema without the chipotle. And then we're also going to be making a queso fresco, which is different than a queso fresco that we've made in previous classes. This is going to be a tofu-based one. So that means that we're not going to have to ferment it and things the way that we've done in the past. So it's going to be really easy to bring it together. And really the point of this queso fresco is just to provide that nice salty, tangy crumble that you would have over the top of something like chilaquiles. We're not going to be eating it by itself like we would in a taco de queso fresco. It's going to be in harmony with all the other elements of the dish. So it won't stand alone. It's going to really work well with all the other elements. So we'll make those, the crema and the queso while the tomatillos are cooking. And so let's get right into it. I have here, and I want to make sure I pull up the recipe just so I have the exact measurements that I'm giving to you all here. And so what I have here is a couple pounds of tomatillos. And I really love tomatillos because they're different than a tomato, right? Like they're actually technically a part of the gooseberry family. So they're not a direct relative of tomatoes is what I've heard. And if you eat them in this raw state, which is possible, they're just so acidic. They're very acidic. And then when you cook the tomatillos, especially fire roasting them, which is the way I typically like to make them. Today, I'm gonna cook them in a skillet, just so I can cook them a bit faster. But it really like mellows out that acidity and makes it a more well-balanced ingredient versus having it be just like a pop of acidity. So I have here 2 pounds, and here we go, 2 pounds of tomatillos, and then I have 2 large jalapeños. You can use serrano if that's what you have on hand. And the way I would fire roast these if I had more time is I would turn on a burner and cook these a couple at a time directly over the flame. If you had a rack that you would use like for a grill, for example, but you might have indoors, like in your house, you can put that directly over your flame and cook it that way, or you can cook it on a grill. At the kitchen for Tolo Verde, we typically use a char broiler, which is very much like a grill that you would use outdoors, and it has the flame coming through, and that's the way we fire roast these. But for today, I'm going to be using, and I have this skillet preheating here. So I just have a cast iron skillet that's just preheating. It's been on just low heat this whole time, just to get it to be a little bit hot. I'm gonna turn it up to just a medium heat. For my stove, that happens to be like 2, which is weird, but whatever, it works out. And I'm going to just put my tomatillos in here. I like to start them off face down, like the where the stem comes out. I like to put that face down for whatever reason. It's not because of anything super specific. That's just the way I like to start off my tomatillos so they don't roll around too much. And so I'm just gonna make sure that they all are in here in a single layer, really important. You don't wanna put one on top of the other and pile them too high because you want them to touch the direct heat source. And so it's gonna get kind of tight in here, but I'm gonna squeeze in the last couple ones here. And then as these cook, they're gonna soften up. So it'll be easier to work with them as they cook because they'll start to create more space for each other as they start to get, because right now you can see that they're really firm. You know, I can't really push into it. It's a really firm tomatillo, but by the time these are cooked, they're gonna be super squishy, soft. This vibrant green is gonna go to a very, very deep green. And so you'll see that transformation happen. And in fact, you could already start to see that green change from where it touched the heat just for those few seconds. So I'm gonna add just my jalapenos just on top right now to get some of that heat. I'm gonna turn my stove up just a little bit. And if you wanted this to get even hotter and cook just a little bit faster, you could also put a tablespoon or 2 of oil in here, and that will sear them off as well as give them that little bit of charness. And so that's another trick that you can do. It's really up to you whether you want to use oil or just dry roast them. So right now I'm just going to dry roast them in this pan. It doesn't have any oil in it, although this is a cast iron skillet, so I constantly season it. So technically it does have a little bit of oil, but not intentional oil that I poured in here to have that cook. And while those are cooking, I also do have a couple other ingredients that I have set aside for this salsa de tomatillo. And they are a couple of different powders. I can't tell which ones which. I have to smell. So this one is cumin, I think. Yeah, this one is cumin. And I have a tablespoon here of just ground cumin. And I have a tablespoon of dried mushroom powder. This is shiitake. If you have another variety of mushroom powder on hand, it'll work just fine. The idea is you just want to give this nice depth of flavor to the salsa. And you know, the fact that it has like so much of it too is really going to give it a nice kick of flavor. And so essentially this tomatillo salsa is going to be the tomatillos, jalapeños, cumino, mushroom powder, some lemon juice. I have about 1/3 of a cup here of some fresh squeezed lemon juice, and some cilantro. I'll take out a bunch of cilantro when we're ready to blend. I have some in my refrigerator right now. And that's gonna give our salsa a really, really nice punch of flavor. And we're also gonna cook the salsa. So once it's all blended up, we're going to add some oil and coat the bottom of a pan and essentially pan fry the salsa for a little bit. So we'll get to that point, but as these are going, this is gonna take about 20 minutes or so. And I'll come back at some point just to turn them so that they cook on the other side. And I'll show you, because you'll see that the bottom gets a nice black char on it, and it gets this like deep green color, but then it's like a gradient, and then it gets really bright, vibrant green on the top because it still hasn't cooked on that side. So I'll double check how these are going as we move along. And so I'm gonna go ahead and start working I'm gonna start with the queso fresco, just to give that some time to kind of let the flavors melt together, because as we know, tofu is a really, really neutral ingredient, and it'll take on any flavor that you give it, but the longer time that it has to sit with those ingredients, the more flavor it'll have. And I probably should have made this like an hour ago, but I didn't want to make a double batch of it. So I'm just gonna show you how I would do it, and then I'd let that sit in the fridge for at least an hour before I use it. It'll technically sit for about an hour because during the duration of this class, it'll be letting the flavors meld together.
Hey, Jocelyn, quick question
so far? Yeah.
Where can you buy the shiitake powder?
I actually bought the shiitake powder at a chef's store. It's called Surface, S-U-R-F-A-S. It's based here in Los Angeles. I believe they do ship nationwide. And so I got it there. You could also technically just buy some dried mushrooms from any store that sells them. Usually Asian grocery stores tend to have a nice variety of dried mushrooms, and you can pulse them in a blender like a Vitamix or a spice, like a spice blender or anything like that, to just break it down until it becomes a powder. And it doesn't have to be super fine powder. Technically, that's still going to get blended in a blender. And even if you had a few little tiny pieces of, mushrooms, it's going to be so small that you can't really identify it anyway. And then Trader Joe's also does have a mushroom umami blend. It does have a few other spices. I believe it does have onion and garlic and a few other things in there. But it's still a really good alternative. So you could use that mushroom umami. But I recommend, if you're exploring a plant-based diet, and even if you don't really love mushrooms, like maybe you kind of like mushrooms, I still recommend that you explore these like mushroom powders, mushroom pastes, because they add a depth of flavor to the dish. And oftentimes you can't really pinpoint like, I'm eating these chilaquiles and I taste mushroom powder in there. You don't really taste it. It's just like a note in the background that gives it like this more depth of flavor. I actually have, let me show you this mushroom paste that I picked up at a local health food store that I use from time to time when I'm like just sauteing veggies, or if I'm making a broth or a soup. It's this brand called Dark Horse, and it's an umami bouillon, and it has smoked king oyster mushrooms, shiitake, tamari, leeks, reishi, and it has Dead Sea ormus. So it has like all these awesome ingredients in here, and it's literally just a paste. So I just take like, a teaspoon worth for, if I'm cooking for like 2 people, which I usually am, and just add that to a lot of different dishes. And it doesn't make it so that the dish always tastes like this. Like, it depends on what you're cooking, and you add enough to really make whatever the main ingredient is. Like if you're cooking peppers, like bell peppers or something, you want the bell peppers to like really shine and taste super good. So you add enough of it where it makes the bell peppers like sing and feel really like delicious on the tongue, but not enough where like everything just tastes like the umami blend. So it's a small jar, but you use a little at a time. And I will admit that my partner here at home, he does not like mushrooms. He grew up just not enjoying mushrooms, and I absolutely love them. And so over time, we figured out that it's mostly a textural thing. So if I make the chorizo and the mushrooms are broken down to a point where they're like tiny little pieces and something like a chorizo that crumbles, and it's not like a whole mushroom, you know, that you're like grilling and then biting into, then that's totally fine. So the flavor is fine, but it's the texture that isn't fine. So if you find that that's the case for yourself or somebody in your family, you can always try to see if you can, you know, throw some of these mushrooms, chop them up, throw them in a food processor, and break it down so it's almost like a ground meat, and season it really well and saute it with other veggies or fill it, you know, in tacos or something like that, and see if there's a difference. Because I know mushrooms have a particular texture that not everybody loves. So you can always try to see if there's different routes to work mushrooms into dishes at home. Okay, so here I have a whole block of firm tofu. So this was, I think it was extra firm tofu, but firm tofu will work fine. And what I did was I just wrapped it in a couple paper towels, and I put it on a plate, wrapped in the paper towels, and then I put my heaviest pot, which is my 6-quart stainless steel pot. It was empty. I just put it over the top so that it gradually pressed it down. You don't have to do all that. I mean, that'll take a little bit more time. I did that just to try to get as much liquid out of it. An alternative could be you just open it up, try to squeeze out as much liquid as you can by hand, and then you can transfer. Let me actually bring a cutting board so I don't make a huge mess here. But this will help get more of the liquid out. So you can transfer it to a cheesecloth, and I cut it up in cubes because when you're trying to squeeze the tofu and it's a whole brick, there's oftentimes like still some liquid in the middle of the tofu. And then this way, if you cut it into these little cubes, you'll get most of the excess liquid out of there. And so I just, you know, you could hand squeeze as much as you'd like, and then put this into a cheesecloth. Bring my bowl back over, and I'm just gonna twist the top ends of the cheesecloth, and I could already start to see some of that liquid wanting to get squeezed out. So every time I squeeze, see that liquid coming out? So you want to try to get as much of this out of your tofu. And this is a good technique for any time that you're gonna crumble tofu. If you wanted to do like slices of tofu or tofu steak or something like that, then you wouldn't do this because obviously this is gonna break up your tofu and it's not gonna be in that nice block form anymore. So I'm gonna end up breaking this down so it's a nice crumble of queso fresco, which is why I'm using this technique. My computer is loving all this liquid shooting at it right now. It's almost time for a new computer. So I'm gonna just squeeze this for just a few more seconds. And I'm just trying to get as much of it out. I'm gonna actually end up putting liquid into the queso fresco. I'm gonna add a couple tablespoons of lemon juice that I already pre-squeezed, a couple of tablespoons of apple cider vinegar, and a nice amount of salt. So one thing with queso fresco or any queso for the most part, it tends to be this like nice punch of salt in a dish, right? So, you know, usually when you look at recipes, they'll be like, you know, if you're gonna use Parmesan or cotija, like don't add too much salt to the dish because it's gonna get salted a bit with the cheese. So same idea here. We want that nice saltiness so that it provides a nice garnishing, finishing touch on our dish. All right, I think I'm straining all my hand muscles now. So I'll give it a rest, but I got a good amount of liquid out of here, and you can keep going for as long as you'd like to get as much of the liquid out of here. And I could already start to see some of it like pushing through the cheesecloth, trying to get out. I'm gonna just dump this liquid out, and then I'm gonna use the same bowl to get all that liquid out. I'm gonna look at my tomatillos for a second. I'm gonna let these hang out on this side for just another like minute or so, but you can see here, this is kind of the char that I'm looking for on a skillet. If it were on a, and I'm able to touch the bottom because it's still not that hot. So you're starting to see that gradient happening. See the color here starting to deepen. I want that color to continue to deepen until it's almost halfway, and then I'll flip them over. All right, so I am going to open up my cheesecloth. And so notice how much drier that texture looks for a queso fresco, right? And so I'm gonna go ahead and crumble here so that I don't have any more big chunks. And the reason is because I want my lemon juice and my apple cider vinegar and my salt to coat every little last bit of this tofu. So I don't want to, just taste the outside flavor, like with the apple cider vinegar and the lemon juice and salt, and then I bite into a cube like this, and in the middle just tastes like tofu. So you want to really try to crumble it so that you can essentially like mask that there's like any tofu in here. And tofu is such an awesome ingredient because obviously you can eat it raw, you can cook it, it takes on any flavor. I've been making on a weekly basis, I have an Instapot and I make a batch of beans. Like last week was black beans, this week I made peppery beans. You can make, pintos, whatever you have on hand, mayacoba. And, you either leave the beans whole, which I did this week for the peppery beans, and I just sauteed some tofu with some mushroom powder, some cumin, a little bit of lemon salt, and I added the peppery beans towards the end to just warm through. And that was like an amazing taco with a little bit of like if you had this like chipotle crema, you can smear on the tortilla before you top it with all the other ingredients. That is a great flavorful taco. All right, it's like all these little cubes are hiding and then they appear, but I think I got most of it. I know that I'm probably gonna find a few here and there. Another trick for taking the liquid out of tofu is if you take the block of tofu out of the plastic container that it comes in, drain all the liquid out, pat it dry with some paper towels or a towel, some tofu overboard there. And then you pop it in the freezer. Pop it in the freezer, let it completely freeze, and then take it out and thaw it out. And just the thawing process is going to remove a lot of that liquid, because it's naturally going to want to like release as much of that liquid as it comes back to room temperature. So that's just another trick. Obviously, that's going to take a lot longer. Or you could simply open the block of tofu the night before and put something weighted like I did with my pot the night before, and let it sit overnight with that weight over it. You can leave it in the fridge that way. And then when you come back to it the next morning, a lot of that liquid should have drained out. So I'm gonna come back to my tomatillos here for a moment, because I'm starting to notice that, for example, this one here is, ooh, they're already trying to come together. So notice that gradient that I'm talking about, that deeper green color, and then it goes to this vibrant green that's still uncooked. I have that nice char. This one's ready to flip. So I'm gonna go ahead and flip this one over. And there's a few more here. They're also ready to flip over. So we're just about halfway there with our tomatillos cooking through. Let me push this back slightly. And if you have a really big one, You could also kind of tilt it so that, you know, it's just not top and bottom, but then you actually kind of cook it tilted a little bit and that'll cook the side. Sometimes some of them are really big. I'm actually growing tomatillos in my garden right now and they're so tiny. I wonder how much larger they're gonna get. All right. Just a couple more here to flip over. And now there's some space for my jalapeños to get closer to the heat source. So I'm gonna pop them a little further down. There we go. So let me just show you real quick what my skillet is looking like here. So I'll keep working it. So this one, for example, is gonna probably need to turn over on the other side. So, but as they continue to cook, it's gonna kind of have them soften up. Like notice how tender this one is now. I can really push into it. And so you want them to get that tender all throughout. This one's really squishy. And sometimes it'll pop and some of the liquid will ooze out. That's totally fine. All right, so back to this queso. So it's as easy as just putting in I have a couple tablespoons of lemon juice, a couple tablespoons of apple cider vinegar, and I'm just gonna go ahead and, actually, I take that back. That's for my salsa. I'm like, does that feel like so much? It's not 2 tablespoons. This is my 2 tablespoons. I have a few measured out, but I didn't label them. They were just like in sections. But yeah, this is the one for my queso fresco. So 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar. That's just gonna get poured right over the top. I'm gonna grab my spatula, which will help me get any little last bit of that juice out and also will help me mix this all together. And I'm also going to add my salt to it. And I'm using here pink Himalayan salt. You can use kosher salt, table salt, whatever you have on hand. Pink Himalayan is not as salty, so I'm gonna add quite a bit now and then give it a taste and see how salty it is. You want it to taste a bit salty. And all you have to do is just pretty much incorporate this all together. Making sure that you're going through and turning your bowl and getting every little last bit of tofu that's on the edge of or on the side of your bowl and working that in. If you have any pieces that are still yet to be broken down, you can just use your spatula to just break it down slightly. All right, and I'm gonna give this a little taste. Definitely needs a little bit more salt. And I'll work that in. And this is also the queso fresco that I use for the, if you have the cookbook, there's a sopa de fideo recipe in there. And I use the tofu queso fresco for that particular soup as a topping, just to kind of have a few different varieties. I know some people have nut allergies, and the queso fresco, that's its own standalone recipe in the book, is a cashew and almond based queso. And so, you know, that's not for everyone. And so that way there's still a little variety of different options. Or if you don't have the ingredients for that, you can use tofu in a pinch, you know, to just make a queso fresco happen. Awesome. Okay. So I am now tasting that acidity and the salt. I just want to taste a few different pieces just to make sure it's all really mixed in. You know, sometimes you try one little piece and maybe you didn't mix it properly and it tastes good, but then another area of your bowl isn't as good. So it's like they say, when you cook a pot of beans, you have to eat at least 5 beans to make sure that they're actually done. Because one bean might taste completely soft and done and 4 others might not. Yeah, I think this is good to go. I'm gonna add just the tiniest little bit more of salt and work that in. And then what you would do at this point is you can put it back into that, the cheesecloth. It could be the same cheesecloth if you'd like, or a new one that's dry. And I would put that cheesecloth to line a bowl that's shaped like a cheese. So for example, you can line that cheesecloth back in here in a bowl that's kind of shaped like a cheese round. And you can put all your little tofu crumbles back in here. And it's never gonna come back to a solid piece. The more liquid you have, it kind of helps the process slightly, but not too much. It's like a nice balance. And what you could do is have this sit in the fridge. So you wanna cover it and really press down on it. So you really wanna press it as much as possible. Again, you can apply something heavy to it and have it sit in the fridge for at least an hour or more. If you had it sit like this overnight, you know, with something really heavy pressing on it, especially if this was a colander where the liquid was, any excess liquid was like released, because the bowl obviously is gonna catch anything that comes out of the tofu. But you'll see here that, you know, if it was just a colander, it would catch it. And so it's starting to mold it again back to sort of that cheese shape where you can pull it out and it kind of holds a little bit of shape. But obviously the longer that that sits, if it sits for a couple hours, it's gonna help that process along, especially if it has something heavy. Like if you can put a small bowl in here or something, and then something heavier on top to just sit and like really weigh it down. If you wanted to catch some of that excess liquid, another trick could be, before you put the cheesecloth in, you could put a paper towel or two underneath, you know, so it would be the bowl, paper towel, cheesecloth, put the tofu mixture in and press it down, and that paper towel will just slightly catch some of that excess liquid. So we're gonna just set this aside while we continue to work on the other elements of our dish. I'm gonna get rid of this bowl and wash my hands. Any questions? No questions. Okay, and let me show you here how my tomatillos are doing again. So check that out. That one's really starting to burst open. So my heat source is hotter here, I can see, than it is here. I'm gonna just shift my pan over. You can always turn it too if you notice that it's cooking pretty unevenly, but those will probably come out of the pan before these other ones are gonna come out. So notice like how much less this one is cooked than over here. So you can transfer and kind of shift things around, or you can simply just turn your pan and try to get the heat source to concentrate in the area that hasn't really gotten as much heat. And you can move things aside to try to see if you can squish in. I'm already seeing I can squish in my jalapeno here. And so they're getting a lot more tender to the touch. So I'll let those keep working as I work on the cashew crema with a little bit of chipotle. So I have a blender here that I'll bring over. And if you've taken the cashew crema class, there's a couple ways that you can make cashew crema in the book. There's one that will sit and ferment on your counter before you add much else to it. So you make it into a cream. It doesn't have really anything else, and you let the probiotics really do their thing for several hours before you then add other elements of the cashew crema. And then there's a really, really simple one where it doesn't have any probiotics. Lemon juice gives it that tanginess, that gives it that hint of, you know, that fermented flavor. And that's the one that we're gonna make today. So it's just a quick cashew crema. I have here 1 cup of, and let me make sure I have this all here properly. Here we go. All right, because I'm kind of a cook that just kind of feels it out and doesn't always like look exactly at the measurements, but I want to make sure that I give you the exact measurements here. So I have 1 cup of raw cashew pieces that I've been soaking for at least maybe an hour or two. And I'm using a Vitamix, which is a high power blender. So if I soak these for, 30 minutes to an hour in that high power blender, it's going to be just fine, just enough time. If you have a home blender that isn't as powerful as a Vitamix, then you want to soak them for a longer period of time. 2 hours in warm to hot water, overnight, however long until you get to the point where they're really soft and pliable to the touch. So they're not crunchy anymore. If you were to, eat one of these, or even if you put them in between your fingers, they do break, but they're a lot more pliable before they get to that breaking point. And these are the ones that are on the top too. The ones at the bottom will be a bit more pliable. And so I'm not going to use this liquid. I'm actually going to drain all the liquid out of this. And I'm going to go ahead and add these cashews to my blender. And before I do that, I just want to mention too that I use raw cashews versus toasted, because the toasted cashews will provide an additional flavor that I don't want in this dish. I just want the raw cashews because they're super neutral in flavor. And it's essentially, I'm going to try to cover the fact that there's any essence of cashews in this dish at all. So anybody who is tasting this doesn't even realize that there's cashews. Just look out for anybody who has any cashew or nut allergies. And then I'm using pieces because it's cheaper to buy raw cashew pieces than it is to buy whole fancy cashew pieces. And this is going to get blended up anyway, so there's no point in getting the more expensive fancy cashews if you're just going to put it in a blender anyway. So let me drain that liquid out. All right, so I have all my liquid drained out of these cashews. I'm going to go ahead and just add them to my Vitamix cup here. All right, so there is that. And then I have here some water and some lemon juice, and I put them together in the same bowl. So I have here, it's a 1/4 cup of lemon juice with a 1/2 cup of water already combined, just to save a bowl. I'm trying to wash less dishes, y'all. So 1/2 cup of just fresh drinking water, 1/4 cup of lemon juice, and that's freshly squeezed lemon juice. If you have bottled lemon juice, that could work too. And then I'm gonna add here some chipotle, and I have chipotle en adobo, but my trick that I like to do is when I open up the can of chipotle en adobo, this one kind of came out like a funky grind because it was a small can. I usually use like a big like restaurant grade one. Like I don't think I have one with me now, but I usually bring one home from work because these last so long. And so what I do is I open up the can, and it's usually the adobo sauce and the chipotles are floating. There's like whole chiles floating in the sauce, if you've never seen that before. And what I do is I blend it. I always blend it because I prefer to just grab a tablespoon of this blended mixture versus getting a chile, and then, a lot of recipes call for like chopping it up and then you have to put it in the dish. I'm like, I chopped it up already. It's already, and some recipes also call for like 1 chile and 2 teaspoons of the sauce. It's like, no, I just do it all together. This for me has been like my trick for many years. And so I pretty much equate 1 tablespoon of this chipotle and adobo mixture that I blended as 1 chile. That's what I like to, I mean, it's probably not exact because obviously some chiles are sometimes a little bit smaller, some are bigger, but this is just the way that I function. And I go faster this way. And so this recipe calls for 1 chile in adobo. You could pull the chile out with a fork out of the can if you'd like, or you can blend it. And like I said, this one came out a little bit like chunky because I have a big old Vitamix and it was like one of those really small cans of chipotle and adobo, but I usually use like a much bigger one and it blends it until it's like a pretty smooth paste. But this is fine because it's still gonna get blended anyway. And even if it had little chunks, like if you were sauteing something and added chipotle, I mean, that's still delicious. So you can't really go wrong. All right, so I'm gonna just drop that into my blender. Trying to get all that out of that tablespoon. And this will last in your fridge for a while. And if you don't have these chipotles and adobo, you could purchase the dry chipotles. There's like chipotle meco or chipotle bonita, and they're just as equally delicious. You can pour some hot water over them and let them rehydrate until they're nice and pliable and soft again. And you can add those chiles, because I know that you know, this chipotle and adobo in the can has other ingredients in it. Honestly, I've been eating this for years, and I could make it if I wanted to, but I just use the can still. But if you wanted something that was just more straight up chipotle and nothing else, then you can make your own chipotle and adobo sauce, and you can add other ingredients to make it your own. So I have here my cashews, some water, some lemon juice, some chipotle and adobo, and last thing I need here is some salt. And again, I'm using pink Himalayan. If you have kosher, you'll probably use a little bit less than I am. It's salt to taste. So, but again, you want this to be slightly salty. You don't want it to be bland. And you're also trying to mask the flavor of the cashews, which the chipotle will help you do, but so will the salt and the lemon juice. If you wanted to add less salt, like if that's something in your diet that you're trying to avoid, you could add a little bit more lemon juice and a little bit less water. And that lemon juice will also act as it'll be more tangy, but you won't need to add as much salt. So I'm going to put the blender top on here. If you don't have a Vitamix, I mean, I absolutely love it because it has this tamper and you can use it to just push everything down into the blender and make sure everything's nice and smooth. If you don't have this, then you can blend, stop your blender, take off the top, use a spatula to scrape down any bits on the side. You want the cashews to be as smooth as possible. You can put it back on the blender, put the top on, and blend it till smooth again. And I'm gonna try to see, I have this like tiny squeeze bottle with a super small opening. I'm gonna try my best to see if I can get that in there just to create a nice little element to garnish the dish. Just pushing everything down. My blender's funny. It's when I go too fast, too high, it turns off. Okay. All right, so you want it to be this nice, creamy, smooth consistency, like that. So it's almost like a spreadable crema. I'm gonna give it a little taste, so add some to the back of your hand, give it a taste. And I could see that it needs a little bit more salt, but it's just about there. It just needs like a touch more. It has enough lemon juice. I can definitely taste that tanginess of the lemon juice. The chipotle is there not to, for me, it doesn't really provide a point of like spiciness. It's more of the flavor of chipotle that you're looking for. So this isn't spicy for me. For others, it might be, but for me, it's just a very mellow point. Obviously, the main ingredient here is cashews, and so the cashews are going to serve as like a neutralizing ingredient so that it doesn't get too hot. All right, and so I have all that all blended up. Let me taste again for salt. And that's great. That's awesome. Okay, so I'm going to try to pour this mixture. You can see it's like nice and creamy and smooth. I'm gonna try to see if I can pour any of it into the squeeze bottle. And it's gonna be messy, y'all. I could already tell it's nice and thick, which is good. So you can add spoonfuls of it, or you could try to add it to, I just need to get a squeeze bottle that has a bigger mouth. So this one is insane, so tiny. But this is my at-home one. I bought it recently because I use squeeze bottles at work, obviously, all the time. And then for these classes, I was like, oh, I should just invest in getting some for home. But you can see how messy it could get. And so just use your spatula, your finger to try to get that in there. I'll just do a little bit more and then I'll focus on this after class. It'll be my project after class. And so what I'm gonna do right now, as soon as I finish pouring just a bit more of this into my squeeze bottle, is I'm going to start grilling up my mushrooms. My tomatillos are just about done, so I'll take them off the heat. Wow, good times, everybody. Look at that. Try to get all of that in there. There we go. That should be enough for me to just show you what that will look like. Try to clean that up a bit. And let me get my towel and put the top on. All right. So a little bit in a squeeze bottle, or you can just do spoonfuls of it. It doesn't need to be, it doesn't need to be a squeeze bottle. I'll get that out of the way. All right. Let me we'll start working on the last couple elements here of our dish. Any other questions so far? We're all good? Okay. All right. So I'm going to start grilling mushrooms because those are also going to take a few minutes. And as those grill, we'll work on assembling or putting together our salsa. So all I'm going to do right now is just take my tomatillos off of the heat. And you can see here, let me actually move these to the camera so you can see. It's easier than holding up the computer. You can see here that a lot of them have exploded. You can see all that juice bubbling in there. And I'm actually going to use the same skillet to cook the mushrooms in because I like this idea of like layering flavors. But I'm going to get all this juice into the blender because that juice is still part of my salsa. So I'm not going to abandon that. I'm going to go ahead and grab another blender cup. And I'm going to start just putting all of this, and let me switch headphones because the one I have in is starting to die. There we go. All right, so I'm just going to grab all of these tomatillos, nice and soft. Ooh, that one just went crazy on me. So they're really soft to the touch. And that will happen, and that's totally okay. All right. So just getting every little last bit of that tomatillo goodness into my blender. And again, if these are fire roasted, you could also technically do this in the oven, although I don't really prefer to do it in the oven unless you have a bunch and it's gonna save you time. Like if you're making like the pozole, for example, in the book, I do oven roast those because it just saves you a little bit of time while you're working on all the other elements, and your stovetop is usually already busy cooking like a bunch of other things. And then the chiles, I want to cut the tops off of the chiles. Honestly, this could have cooked a little bit more, but it's fine this way. This one is a little bit more cooked through. You can see the difference in the color. This one is a little bit more vibrant. And the thing with the jalapeños that you want to do is you want to see where they're at in terms of heat level. So if you are not a big fan of spicy food, you can cut off the stem, cut it in half lengthwise, and take out the seeds and the ribs, and just set them aside, because sometimes the jalapeños are not that spicy and you want to add a little bit more kick to it, and that's what the seeds and the ribs of the chile will do for you. So you can do that, or you can just take a taste, which is what we do with Olo Verde. Every single chile that we use, from ceviche to salsas, we taste every single one, because sometimes they're really spicy and sometimes they're not, and you want to be able to manage that heat in your dish. So I'm gonna go ahead and transfer these 2 chiles to another. Actually, let me grab my same cutting board here. And I'm just gonna cut that stem off. And they're hot, so you wanna use your tongs here to just cut that stem off. Make sure you compost that. You can cut your chile lengthwise. Open it up. Honestly, just by smelling, I can sense this chile actually smells sweet. Yeah, they're not spicy at all. I can already tell that they're not spicy, but you can just give it a little sliver taste here. Actually, it does have a little kick, which I'm okay with. It's not spicy at all though. Like, it has like just a back note, but it blends into the background pretty quickly. So I'm gonna go ahead and add these whole into my blender. And let me go ahead and get my mushrooms going, because I wanna make sure we have enough time for everything. So I am going to use a spatula to scrape every little last bit out of my cast iron skillet here. And then I'm gonna add my oil and start cooking up the mushrooms. And honestly, this is gonna leave a little bit of like coloration on them. You could cook them all separately. Like, you could have a pan, you know, for your tomatillos, you could have one for your mushrooms, and then use that same one to cook the chilaquiles into. I'm just gonna go for it and do this, because why not? So it's gonna make them a little bit darker, because there's already been something cooking in here. All right, so I'm gonna make sure my heat here is again on the medium heat, medium high. For mushrooms, you want your heat to be slightly hot, and it might get a little smoky, and that's okay. And I actually don't salt the mushrooms until they've already at least seared off on one side. So mushrooms are interesting in that if you add too much salt to them, they get kind of juicy and ooze out some of the liquid, and I don't want that. So I'm gonna go ahead and wait to salt them. Okay, so I'm gonna grab my mushrooms here, and I'm just gonna break them down slightly so that I can sear them in a way that just makes sense. Like, I don't wanna add a whole mushroom like this. And it's up to you, like, depending on the oyster mushrooms that are featured in the recipe are a little bit smaller. They're probably about half this length. And so you can just cut them in half lengthwise if they're really wide. These are obviously a lot longer, so you can keep them long if you wanted to, or you can cut off the stem, but I would still use the stem. It just depends on how much of it you want to use. Like, this one actually is still pretty tender and soft even at the bottom. Sometimes, let's see, these don't really have a good example, but sometimes this one is maybe a little bit of an example. This one's really tough at the bottom. So I'm likely gonna cut this off and I'll compost that. I'm not using this because this is like kind of hard. It's not gonna get too much softer by cooking it. And so then I have a little bit more of a tender piece here, more pliable piece of king oyster mushroom, and I'm just gonna cut this one in half lengthwise. And so you can figure out what shapes and sizes you want for the mushrooms that you have. If you don't have oyster mushrooms, I recommend if you don't have oyster mushrooms, like if you're using, if you have portobello or if you have creminis, like creminis would be really nice. Sometimes I like to just quarter them. So like I would, cut it in half. This is a shiitake, not a cremini, but just it's similar shape. And then cut it in a quarter. They have these like little quarter pieces. But I'm gonna cut off a little bit of this stem because it's not the part of the dish that I want. And if any of your mushrooms are kind of dirty, you could get a damp cloth or a really sturdy damp paper towel and just wipe them clean. Unless you have like a whole bunch of them, you don't really want to put them in water because mushrooms are notorious for absorbing liquid, and they'll absorb the water and then they'll get really soggy as you try to cook them. So I'm going to probably just cook a little bit of and these shiitakes are starting to get a little dried out actually. So I'm not going to put too much because I don't want to crowd my pan. So I'd likely need to do a couple rounds of mushrooms. Here are my beach mushrooms. I'm going to cut off the bottom of it, which you can see here. I wouldn't want to include here. This is like already kind of like getting into their roots. That's going to get composted to get that out of the way. And then one thing I like to do with these types of mushrooms is like keep them in like little florets, So I would, sometimes they'll break apart on their own, but I'll keep them in this size versus individual little stringy mushrooms, which is still fine. And so I have here my cast iron that's still warm from earlier. And I'm going to go ahead and add my mushrooms, and I'll bring you over in a second, but let me add them in here. And again, I want my skillet to be pretty hot. I can see that it's just gently sizzling. I turned up the heat right now because I didn't want to be like blazing hot before I put in the mushrooms.
Yeah. Jocelyn, just curious,
where
do you get your mushrooms? They just look amazing.
Oh, thank you. I got these mushrooms at a local grocery store. It's like a local health food store here in Highland Park called Fresco Market. But you can get mushrooms like this, like even at Whole Foods, sometimes at Asian markets. I mean, Asian markets have like probably the biggest variety of mushrooms. But the thing that I found is that even regular oyster mushrooms, I don't like all of them. There's one, I don't know if it's like a certain, like, it's like a family of different mushrooms, but there's one that like sometimes makes me feel a little bit nauseous. My body just doesn't like it. Like it likes as I'm eating it, but now I'm starting to catch like, oh, I think this is a variety of oyster mushroom that I don't like, and I'll kind of not eat as much of it. But yeah, I just get these at a local health food store. I've also seen people like who don't have as much access to mushrooms. Like there's this friend of mine, she has a zero waste account. Zero Waste Cindy is her handle if you want to look her up. And I've seen her sometimes like use dried mushrooms, and she rehydrates them in hot water and then tries to get some of that excess water out. And then she like sears them or throws them in a soup, or, so the main thing is like you want that flavor that the mushrooms provide.
Jocelyn, did you add oil to that pan?
Yes, I did. So I added a few tablespoons I just added grapeseed oil that I have here at home. You can use, and I know a lot of people have olive oil at home. If you do have olive oil for cooking at this like higher smoke point, you don't really have to use extra virgin olive oil. You can use regular olive oil because it's more expensive, the extra virgin, and you're gonna still lose some of that flavor because it's like cooking at such a high temperature. And so it's up to you what you wanna end up using. But at home, I use grapeseed oil, and at the kitchen, we use organic rice bran oil. So it's up to whatever you have on hand. I've used avocado oil It's fine for cooking. I personally don't like the smell of avocado oil. Maybe it's the brand that I've gotten, but I smell like a chemical flavor. And it could be because if they're not like a cold press or expeller press, which is like just using a machine to essentially like push out the oil out of like whatever they're making the oil out of. Sometimes there's a chemical solvent that's used to press to help like get the oil out. And I almost wonder if like that's what I was smelling, but I just was like not about that life. So it's up to you, whichever flavor profile you like. And like this grapeseed oil that I'm using, I don't ever use it for like salads and stuff. I use extra virgin olive oil for that. So I do have extra virgin olive oil, but that's not what I use for cooking. But again, it's up to you. Right now, I'm actually reading this really interesting book, which I'll bring over to while we're waiting for this. It's called How to Be a Conscious Eater. I feel like I'm already a conscious eater, but I'm such a nerd about it. Like I always want to keep learning more and more about, you know, different oils or like, you know, what does it mean when something says it's like free range, grass fed, like just all the different, essentially at this point, like marketing gimmicks that people use to make you feel like you're making a better decision about the products that you're buying. And it's really interesting too, because it also breaks down, for example, like different labels that are on food. So this one was about fair trade. And it breaks it down so that you know like which ones have the strongest like restrictions and guidelines. So it's like, oh, if it has this label, well, that technically isn't like a really legit certification. So it doesn't really like hold much weight, but this label does. And so it's a really great book so far. I'm all about like continuing to like learn and catch up on all this stuff. So I'm trying to find the other labels, but I'm probably not going to be able to find it. But yeah, definitely a great book. I just got this from a bookstore called Now Serving, which is a cookbook store here in Los Angeles. And you should definitely support them. They're based in Chinatown and they sell all books related to food. So I bought this and a couple cookbooks from them. All right, so I haven't salted, I'm getting hot in here. I haven't salted my mushrooms yet, but I can see here that they're nice. They're starting to get nice and soft. Like this one looks already like it's getting nice and juicy. Check that out. And reminder that some of this color is because the tomatillos were in here, but it is also giving a nice, good sear, which I like. So I'm gonna flip these over. I'm gonna let them cook for another couple minutes, and then I'm gonna salt them. The reason I haven't salted them yet is because I haven't salted or seasoned them, because I'm gonna add some mushroom powder and some cumin. But because this is at such a high temperature, the seasoning will just like burn off really quickly. And so I'm gonna let these cook for another few moments. I'm actually gonna put these in the center, and I have a little bit of cooling of oil here, and these drier shiitakes, I'm gonna add them there. So they can kind of sop up a little bit of that oil and cook, because they're just feel a little dried out to me. All right. And I know it's in our nature to like, when we're cooking something, we just want to like saute it and just like mix it around. But I find that this method of like flipping each individual piece works better for me, because you have more control. Because if you just move it around and saute it, you could end up landing on the same side that it was cooking on, and it just like ends up, you know, over cooking on one side and still feels pretty raw on the other. All right, so I'll let that keep going for a few minutes. And again, I'm gonna do this thing where I just turn my skillet and just make sure I'm like cooking it evenly. And once I let this go for another minute, I'll go ahead and season them pretty liberally. I have a teaspoon of cumin, a teaspoon of dried shiitake powder. I'm not gonna use all of it, because remember, I'm cooking them in batches and I still haven't even cooked these yet. So I'm only gonna use a couple pinches of each of those, and just be pretty generous with my salt here, and these will be good to go. And so these are gonna be used as kind of like a garnish in our dish. And I'll go ahead and add it now. And that's this here. I have a teaspoon of cumin, teaspoon of dried shiitake powder. So in this case, I'm using similar seasoning that I've used everywhere else. And let me go ahead and lower my heat because I don't want this to get really smoky and burn off. But obviously the pan is going to stay hot for some time. And so I'm just going to sprinkle on, try to sprinkle pretty evenly here over the top. My cumin, my mushroom powder. Let me do some salt. Oh, my salt is here, duh. It's always over here. Just used to cooking at home this way already. All right, and there's that. And then now I could, because I know I've given it some time to sear on the one side, sear for a little bit on the other side. I'm moving a bit quickly because I know we're almost out of time too. So I'm gonna go ahead and just make sure I mix in all my seasoning here, but I'm being pretty gentle and mixing up all my mushrooms here just to make sure that they get evenly coated with my seasoning. All right. And so that is good to go. I'm gonna lower that heat as much as I can. And let me blend my salsa now. So I have my tomatillos, my 2 jalapeños. Again, I have some cumin, some mushroom powder. I have a tablespoon of each. This is what I showed earlier. So it's gonna have a nice punch of flavor. And then I have 1/3 cup of lemon juice that I'm gonna add in here. So it's gonna be nice and tangy. And then I'm gonna add some salt. And the last thing that I need to grab out of my fridge is some cilantro. Let me go ahead and grab that. Where are you? Oh, there it is. And I like to, my fridge is like a bunch of like bases with greens in them. This is the way I store my cilantro, see all the water in there, and it lasts so much longer. So this was 2 bunches. I've been kind of grabbing some here and there, but I'm gonna grab about a bunch of cilantro here. And I'm just going to tear, I'm gonna use stems and all. I'm just going to tear it in half and toss it in there. And grab every little last bit. This piece I didn't want, it was a little bit yellow. There we go. And I'm gonna go ahead and blend this until it's smooth, but I still want a little bit of chunky texture in there. So I'm gonna blend it enough till it kind of breaks it down, but not enough where it's like, you know, obliterated into like a smooth paste. So I'll blend this up, it'll be really quick. And so essentially this is the texture that I'm looking for. It's one where I can still see the tomatillo seeds, it's a bit chunky. I like that texture. And so right now I'm gonna just give it a taste, make sure that it's salty enough, it's so hot. Let me take my mushrooms out of here and put them in a bowl. All right, so all my mushrooms are gonna just be hanging out, waiting for me until they're ready to be a garnish on the dish. And I'm gonna use the same pan. So obviously I'm a fan here of using the same pan. Let me actually add this over here. And now I'm gonna add you all over here now that I've cleared out most of my stuff on the on this countertop. So I have my pan here. You can try to get every little last bit of the mushrooms out. Ooh, that's really yummy. This is like the part that I live for, like all the little burnt pieces. But I'm gonna go ahead and add some more oil. So for the mushrooms, I added about just like a tablespoon because I'm cooking them in batches, maybe like a tablespoon and a half. Actually, I added too much oil right now because I'm not gonna make all the salsa. So what you would do is you would add another nice layer of oil on your skillet and make sure that it's nice and hot. And then you would add your tomatillo salsa in here, which we're gonna do right now, to just sear it and really get it to simmer and get really hot, nice and hot. I'm not gonna add all of it because again, I'm just making this for me. But you could, if you're making all of it right now, what you could do is you can add all of the salsa and then see how that's already sizzling. You could add all of the salsa and then take out whatever you're not going to use for this dish right now. So you already have like your seared salsa ready to go. The reason I'm only making it right now, so like such a little bit, wow, and that's actually a lot of it, to be honest with you, for one helping of chilaquiles, it's because chilaquiles is not a dish that you can store in the fridge. Like you can store the sauce in the fridge and the other elements, even the mushrooms, although you know, I have been keeping some seared mushrooms already cooked in the fridge so I can like easily add them to dishes throughout the week. But if you do too much of that, sometimes they get like rubbery in the fridge. So I have them in like an airtight deli container. But just something to consider. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my spatula here. And notice that this tomatillo salsa is pretty thick. Like when I kind of go through the center, it takes a while for it to like ooze back to the center, you know? So if you wanted your tomatillo salsa to be a little bit less thick, what you could also do is you can add a little bit of veggie broth to this. So like in this case, you know, I usually have some veggie stock that's either ready to go, or if you have some that you make on your own, you can easily make it from mushrooms or carrot tops or veggies that you just have lying around. Celery is always a really good one. So you can just add a little bit of it to just slightly loosen your tomatillo salsa. Just so it's a little bit more runny. This one's still kind of oozing. But until it gets to the consistency that you prefer. So again, it really depends on your preference. Like chilaquiles is all about your preference. Like I said, some people like it in this like casserole form. I personally don't prefer it that way. I like it when it's like, you know, immediately you put the, you know, the chips into the salsa once it's done and you immediately serve it. So it doesn't sit there for a long period of time. But I have seen where people, for example, will put the chips in and they'll make sure to like coat all the chips in the sauce, in the salsa, and then they'll turn off the heat and they'll put a lid on it and like let it sit there with the lid on. That one's okay. I'm a little bit torn about that. I just prefer like serving immediately. So you want this to kind of simmer. You can have it reduced down slightly. You can add more veggie broth to loosen it up if you'd like. And I have some chips here. So I'm just gonna make enough for me to eat like a small little plate right now. So all you wanna do is you wanna toss your chips, which this is like about a handful of chips, into your salsa. And I like to work it gently so that you don't break the chips, but I wanna make sure that that the chips are coating of salsa here on the top and the bottom of the chip. And if this takes a while and it's like super bubbling and hot, you can always turn off the heat at this point because the salsa is already really hot. So it's gonna keep it's gonna still warm your chips through. And you wanna have good tortilla chips here. So these ones that I have are ones that we use for Todo Verde. They're a restaurant quality chip that we get from a wholesaler in downtown. I know that if you shop at Trader Joe's has a really good restaurant chip, tortilla chip that they sell. I am not a fan of like Mission round tortilla chips. If that's your jam and you love them, you know, more power to you. But just FYI, those are not the kind of chips that they would use in a restaurant, which is where most people tend to get their chilaquiles. So I'm gonna go ahead, and again, this was too much salsa. I did like a heaping pour. But notice that my chips are still kind of holding up slightly. They have a little bit of crunch to them. That's what I like. But if you're not up for eating something like this, then you can have them cook here a little bit longer. And they'll keep getting soggy as I, you know, take time to add the other elements. All right, I think I got all of them now. And so what I'm gonna do now is just add my other elements to the dish. So I have my crema, which I am going to squeeze on. And I'm gonna try to bring most of it to the top of the bottle towards the nozzle. And I'll just squeeze that over the top. If you have any imperfections like that one just squirted there, it's totally fine because you can cover it up with the other elements that you're gonna top it with. So I have that. I have my cooked mushrooms, which you can just toss on there, like delicately, like figure out, oh, okay, I mean, obviously for this dish, I have like a mixture of a couple different mushrooms. So I can, you know, make sure that I'm kind of mixing it up, you know, like here's some of those beach mushrooms. I'm just kind of tossing it around in different areas. I really like the way the sear looks on these king oyster mushrooms. So those are kind of like the star of the dish. All right, there's that. And then you get some of that queso fresco that I am taking out of the mold. And I'm just gonna get a little bit to crumble over the top. There we go. And you can add as much or as little of this as you wanted to. So you have obviously that whole round of queso fresco. You can use quite a bit, or you can use it for other dishes. But this recipe makes for at least like 5 people or so. And then lastly, just to give a contrast of color, add a little bit of sprigs of cilantro throughout. You can kind of, I like to use the whole leaves versus like mincing for garnishes. So there is my chilaquiles. Any questions? I saw the little clapping hands.